So based on the fact that the learning objective starts with a 1, now we're moving on to the actual content for Unit 5. All right, so the unit's called Graphing Quadratics. All right, so that's what we're going to start talking about. And this video is going to kind of just be like a vocab video, figuring out when we say certain things, what do we mean in our graphs. All right, so just to set up for a bit, all right, in our previous unit, we spent most of the time learning how to solve quadratic equations. So we did this in the foundational objectives for this unit as well, solving by factoring, solving by completing the square. You could use square roots, you could use the quadratic formula. So that was our last unit, learning all these ways to solve quadratic equations. And in this unit, we're going to discuss how to graph a quadratic function. So first of all, a function, we have this notation we haven't used in a little bit, is f of x equals. So this is just saying our function, our input's x, and our output is this expression on the right. But the important thing to remember, when we're talking about a quadratic, we have this x squared. As soon as you see an x squared, then you know you're talking about a quadratic, and all the stuff that we're talking about in last unit in this unit applies. And when you get rid of the x squared, then you just have a linear equation, which is just a line. All right, so kind of going back to the basics of graphing, how would we graph the function f of x equals x squared? We've done problems like this before. If you don't know kind of sophisticated methods of graphing, which we'll learn throughout this unit, all right, the way you can always graph a function is just making a chart of x values and y values. Since x is the input, we get to choose what x is, but our function will tell us what y has to be. So generally, I'll always start with kind of the small numbers around 0. All right, so -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. They're small numbers, they're easy to plug in, and they're kind of in the center of my graph, so I can kind of figure out what my graph is going to look like. All right, so I plug these in. My function tells me when I plug in x, I square it. So I'm going to take this -2 and square it. And remember, when you square a negative, it becomes positive, so I get +4. -1 squared is +1. 0 squared is 0. 1 squared is 1. And 2 squared is 4. And why is that useful? Well, it's useful because each of these xy pairs gives me a point on my graph. So if I plug in the x value -2, I get the y value 4, and that's a dot on my graph right there. -1, 1 is that dot. 0, 0 is that dot. 1, 1 is that dot. And 2, 4 is that. And you can keep plugging in more points. You can plug in these fractions kind of in these places. All right, but now we can just kind of connect them in a way that makes sense. And the thing that looks like it's happening is it's coming down through these red dots, has to turn and go back up through those. All right, so in some books, they'll call this the parent function of the quadratics. This is kind of the most simple quadratic you can have. The most important thing about a quadratic is having x squared, and this just has just the x squared. All right, so this is like the parent function of all quadratics. So they all come from this original function, which means all the graphs are going to come from this original graph. So this shape we have, this kind of U shape, is what we're going to be dealing with for the whole unit. All right, and that's basically what I said, and the name of that shape is a parabola. All right, so when we say parabola, it just means we have that U shape. All right, this is a parabola. You can make them wider, you can make them thinner, you can make them go the other direction, wide or thin. All right, so any parabola that kind of has this gentle curve shape is the graph of a quadratic. All right, so we're going to talk about two different parts of our quadratics that are going to be important for the whole unit. So the first one's intercepts. All right, we've discussed intercepts before. They're just when your graph crosses one of the axes. All right, so I'm not even going to do an example for this one. I just want you to try this one on your own straight from the start. Identify all the intercepts of this quadratic graph. And these are the three intercepts. So our graph crosses the x-axis at -1 and 3. So we have an x-intercept at -1 and an x-intercept at 3. And we end up caring about x-intercepts more than y-intercepts in practice, but a y-intercept still is important. All right, so we cross that y-axis there at y equals -3. All right, so we have these three different intercepts, but again, we're just looking at the graph, figuring out where it crosses. All right, the next one is the new thing that we haven't talked about before, and this is kind of the turning point of a quadratic. So again, if I just draw a couple quadratics, again, they can be different shapes, but they're all just these gentle arcs. They all have a turning point, which is either the highest point in this picture or this lowest point in these two pictures. All right, every quadratic, because they all have these general shape, will always have this lowest or highest point, and this point is known as the vertex of your quadratic. All right, so the vertex of your quadratic is where this turn happens, and it's kind of an important value because you know this is the lowest point or the highest point, and it makes it easier to graph from there. All right, so in this video, we're just going to practice finding the vertex. But again, the definition of the vertex is where that turn happens. So if I look at my quadratic, when it's going up like this, it's this lowest point down here. And then it's just a matter of correctly identifying the point. I went right 3, so the x value is 3. And I went down 2, so the y value is -2. Right, so the vertex of this quadratic is 3, -2. All right, one more. All right, this one is a parabola that's going downward, so now the vertex is the highest point, but again, it's just where this turn happens. It starts going in the opposite direction, and that happens up there. And then again, the last thing is just identifying the point correctly. The x value is 2, the y value is 4. All right, so the point 2, 4 is the vertex of this quadratic. All right, so not too difficult, just knowing like what it means when I say the vertex. It means it's the place where you do that turn. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. All right, find the vertex of this quadratic. And the vertex is at -1, -3, all right, my x value and my y value. All right, so now go ahead and practice identifying these things. All right, just to give you an idea of what the skill check's going to be. All right, there's going to be 2 graphs where you have to identify the vertex, and then 2 graphs where you have to identify all of the intercepts. So again, I mentioned in that example that most people forget the y-intercept. I prefer all those. You should get the x-intercepts and the y-intercept. All right, so there's going to be 4 questions, all right, 2 vertex ones, 2 intercepts ones.